Because it is in this way posited that the validation of duty as something absolutely sacred falls outside of actual consciousness, this latter accordingly stands altogether on one side as the imperfect moral consciousness. Just as in regard to its foreknowledge it knows itself then as a consciousness whose knowledge and conviction are imperfect and contingent, similarly in regard to its willing, it knows itself as a consciousness whose purposes are effected with sensuousness. On account of its unworthiness, therefore, it cannot look on happiness as necessary, but as something contingent, and can expect it only as a gift of grace. Paragraph 608 is another one of these short, little, punchy paragraphs in a whole sequence, talking about the relationship between these two sides of moral consciousness. And here we're looking at the actual or real, wirkliche, moral consciousness, the Bewusstsein, being aware of something. And he says that because it is in this way posited that the validation of duty, the Gelten des Pflichts, right? Pflicht is duty. Gelten could be validation, could be assigning worth to it. So what's the implication here of the language? That we're not entirely getting what the value or worth of duty in fact is. Or if we are getting that right, it's kind of accidental. We're in a certain sense estranged from absolute duty. This is a very interesting thought to ponder over. So he says it's posited that the validation as something absolutely sacred, something holy, right? It falls outside of actual consciousness. What is the implication of that? Actual consciousness, he says, is standing altogether on one side. It's over here as the imperfect moral consciousness. Now, Hegel, the term that he's using is unvollkommene, right? And that can mean imperfect, but it's imperfect not in the sense of like having a checklist and you just didn't get everything on the checklist. You know, like when we think about figure skaters and they're skating around and the judges bring up the cards and somebody's like, wow, 10 out of 10, perfect score. They did every single thing the way they're supposed to do it, right? Or perfect performance review. The figure skater one, if we think it through a little bit more, what goes into making something go from a 9.8 to a 10? You know, and how do you compare these different performances which are really not that similar to each other, except in the fact that they're out on the ice with leotards or whatever it is that they're wearing on and skating around. I mean, what makes this one, this performance better objectively than this one over here? And it has to do with the other side of the vollkommene, right? The other side of the having been brought to its conclusion. This is an older sense of perfection. One in which, you know, we see Aristotle working over and over again, or the Stoics or others. When they talk about something being perfect, they mean that it is brought to its fullest degree of development. And so our moral consciousness might not just be imperfect in the sense of being sinful as opposed to holy, or falling short, or, you know, having some bad intentions. It's not as developed as it ought to be. There's something missing. There's a privation of a good that ought to be there in that moral consciousness. So he says that this is an imperfect moral consciousness. How so? Well, there's two modalities, and these are ones that are quite familiar to us from this section and the previous section. Knowing and willing, wissen and wollen, right? So he says, with respect to its knowledge, it knows itself as a consciousness whose knowledge and conviction are imperfect and contingent. What does that mean in relation to duty? Our knowledge and conviction are imperfect and contingent. Let's think about the conviction. It's one thing we're all familiar with knowing what we ought to do and not being able to get ourselves to do it, whether it be duties to ourselves, like, making sure that we actually do the work that we decided for ourselves, whether it's duties to other, following through on an obligation that we don't really want to fulfill, duties in other ways, right? We're all familiar with a failure of conviction. This is something that the Greeks called akrasia, a lack of self-mastery. And there's a lot of debate about, well, does it really happen? Why does a person know the good but fail to do the good or to pursue the good or defend the good? There's a lot of interesting points there to consider, but we're not going to go deep into that. Let's just take it for granted that we do, in fact, have this experience. And we can notice that there's a sort of double modality here, right? We can know that our conviction is imperfect and that it's contingent. What does it mean that it's contingent? Zufällig. It means that it might depend on other things. Like some days you really feel like following through on things, other days you don't. Right? We know that fulfilling your duties is tougher after you've had a long, stressful day and you're hungry than when you wake up in the morning feeling rested and chipper. So that's the conviction part. What about the knowledge part? How does that affect duty? Do we really know what all of our duties are? We might be deficient with respect to some of them. We may, in fact, have mistaken ideas about how people ought to treat other people, ought to treat themselves. This is a age-old problem, isn't it? And human consciousness does, in fact, develop towards better and better understandings of that. But every single generation has to figure these matters out for itself. That's part of what it means to transmit human culture. And there can be massive failures, or cultures can go into decline along these lines as well. The knowledge that we have of our duties is in some respect contingent. It's also often imperfect. What about our willing? Is our willing imperfect and contingent? Yes, we've already covered that a little bit in talking about the akrasia part. Notice that the willing itself can be somewhat reflexive. He goes on a little bit further here and he says, in regard to its willing, it knows itself as a consciousness whose purposes are affected with sensuousness, a term that we came across before, having all of these other non-duty-based inclinations, desires, and drives. I want to do the right thing, and yet at the same time, I want to eat that hamburger. And I can't have both, right? And the hamburger really is attractive right now. This is a silly example, but you get the point here. That's something that is conceivable for us, if not necessarily for me, myself, at least for, remember that character in Popeye who was very hamburger hungry? I forget his name. I think it was Wimpy, and he was constantly promising people to pay them back on Tuesday for a hamburger today because he wanted hamburgers so badly, even after he'd made a whole bunch of bad promises in the past that he should have fulfilled by giving other people hamburgers. He wants that hamburger for himself. That's a perfect example of sensuousness and its impact on the will. What's the upshot of this for Hegel? He goes on and he says, on account of its unworthiness, if you're aware of just how badly off you are, the fact that your knowledge and your willing is in some respect deficient, then you're aware of being unworthy in relation to the pure divine will. And he says, it cannot look on happiness as necessary, but something contingent, something that it can only expect as a gift of grace. And where does that grace come from? The holy will. As Hegel's been calling it, the master, the ruler of the world, the divine lawgiver, provides us with the happiness that we enjoy. Now, you could take that out of the picture and say, well, maybe that's also contingent as well because we don't understand how grace works. Hegel doesn't do this at that point. Again, not because Hegel is necessarily committed to that, but he's following out the development of moral consciousness as it works through its own contradictions. But although its actuality is imperfect, all the same its pure will and knowledge hold duty to be what is essential. In the notion, therefore, so far as the notion is contrasted with reality or in thought, it is perfect. But the absolute being is just this being that is thought, a being that is postulated beyond reality. It is, therefore, the thought in which morally imperfect knowledge and willing are held to be perfect, and the absolute being, since it gives full weight to this imperfection, bestows happiness according to worthiness, that is, according to the merit ascribed to the imperfect moral consciousness. Here in paragraph 609, another short one in this block of little paragraphs, all connected together, we're seeing an interesting transformation begin to take place that is going to reach its culmination in the following paragraph. So what is that? We just saw that the moral consciousness that we have is imperfect, right? In terms of its knowledge, which also includes its conviction, as Hegel says, and its willing. And we have also at the same time this absolute being, as he's going to call it here, the divine lawgiver, the ruler and master of the world, who somehow aligns happiness and morality, or whatever else it is, nature and morality we want to oppose to each other, that we postulate that within this being somehow that happens. So he says, though its actuality is imperfect, the actuality of contingent, real moral consciousness, he says its pure will and knowledge hold duty to be what is essential. And so in the notion, what's the notion? It's over here on this side of absolute being. Insofar as the notion is contrasted with reality or in thought, it's perfect. The concept, the G.W.F. And this is in a projected subjectivity, right? An other. So he says, the absolute being is just this being that is thought. A being postulated, very important here, as beyond reality, beyond Wirklichkeit. So, it doesn't do any good to say, we observe that in the world, happiness and morality don't coincide. There's a lot of people who are unhappy, who really deserve to be happy, and there's a lot of miserable bastards who aren't really miserable because they get over, and everything turns out roses for them. Well, that's not really an objection to this, because this is postulated in thought beyond that reality. There's a little bit of impotence there that we're going to talk about in a bit, but let's go on with this. So he says, in this thought, he says, it's therefore the thought in which morally imperfect knowledge and willing are held to be perfect. So there's a kind of perfectioning carried out by whatever we want to call it, grace, the behind-the-scenes working of this absolute being. There is a perfecting of our morally imperfect knowing and willing. Something helps us out so that the halfway good, halfway crap efforts that we can make and understanding of things that we have actually fulfills the duties that we're supposed to fulfill, these pure duties. So he says, these are held to be perfect. The absolute being, since it gives full weight to this imperfection, bestows happiness according to worthiness. And we just saw in the last paragraph that the morally imperfect consciousness understands its own unworthiness in relation to this being of pure duty, what Kant calls a holy will, the divine being. And yet at the same time, this divine being is helping it, is changing it in some way. So he says, it gives happiness according to worthiness, that is, according to the merit ascribed to the imperfect moral consciousness. So, if we want to sort of be a little facetious here, we could say that the holy will, the divine rule giver, is always looking on the bright side of things and seeing what's not perfect, but at least on the way to perfection, what can be worked with over here on the side of the morally imperfect consciousness and its knowledge and its willing. It fills in the gaps. So it then does bestow happiness upon it. And that happiness, in a way, it's not merited, but in a way it gives, that is, the divine rule giver, gives whatever is needed so it could merit the happiness. This is a thought that we have to work out a little bit more fully here. In this, the moral view of the world is completed. For in the notion of the moral self-consciousness, the two aspects, pure duty and actuality, are explicitly joined in a single unity. And consequently, the one, like the other, is expressly without a being of its own, but is only a moment or is superseded. This becomes explicit for consciousness in the last phase of the moral view of the world. That is to say, it places pure duty in a being other than itself. That is, it posits pure duty partly as something existing only in thought, partly as something that is not valid in and for itself. Rather, it is the non-moral consciousness that is held to be perfect. Equally, it gives itself the character of a consciousness whose actuality, not being in conformity with duty, is superseded, and qua superseded, or in the idea of absolute being, no longer contradicts morality. Here in paragraph 610, Hegel will tell us that the moral view of the world has been completed. Now, it's not completely completed, we could say. The German word here is vollendet, but certainly a phase of its development has been brought to its conclusion. The moral view of the world, let's remind ourselves, he's using this Weltanschauung, this intuition of how the world in fact is, but we've seen, of course, that it is much more than merely an intuitive grasp on things. It's sort of a pervasive comprehension that is approaching what we call the notion, the Begriff. So he says, in the notion, the Begriff of the moral self-consciousness, we have these two aspects that we've been juggling back and forth: pure duty, morality, and actuality. Could be nature, happiness, the will, as we actually do in fact will it, experience it. He says these are explicitly joined in a single unity, and consequently the one, like the other, both of them, are without a being of their own, but are only a moment. They only really, as we found now through pursuing this, exist in relation to each other. They have their meaning in relation to each other. So he says that they are superseded. They are aufgehoben, right? This is telling us that an important transition has taken place. Because remember, Aufhebung is this fundamental notion running throughout the Hegelian dialectic. It means something like surpassing and yet preserving the essential moments integrated within a larger whole. It's not merely leaving the previous shape of consciousness behind, but rather reintegrating what is important, what has been achieved within them. So pure duty and actuality, reality, if you like, these are both moments for the moral consciousness, for the notion of moral consciousness. Now he goes on and he tells us that this becomes explicit for consciousness in the last phase of the moral view of the world. Now, what is he saying there? Think about the fact that we are not in the last paragraph of the section of the moral view of the world. We're at paragraph 610, and there are actually 615 paragraphs. We're at paragraph 615, and when we finish up that section and move into the dissemblance or duplicity. So what should this tell us? We are not completely done with the moral view of the world. It has not been made totally explicit at this point, but we have arrived at a very important turning point. Well, what is this? He says, it places pure duty, this is something we realized in the previous paragraphs, in a being other than itself. Moral consciousness places pure duty not within itself, not within the uncomprehending universe, but in some other subjectivity, in an other, a capital O other, if we want to get, Lacanian about this, right? That we can, in fact, relate ourselves to in some way. We can conceive of it as the divine lawgiver, as the ruler of the universe. We can think of it as that which gives us the grace to improve ourselves and which helps us, merit some happiness. We can think of it in whatever way we want, but it's something different than ourselves. It's not just us. So he says, it posits pure duty as something existing only where? In thought. Now, in whose thought? In the thought of the thinker out there thinking whatever thoughts God thinks? No, in our thought. That being, that other out there doing what it's doing, being a pure holy will, is in a certain way only for us. So he says, it's partly as something that's not valid in and for itself. We are starting to realize maybe we're valid in and for ourselves. Well, maybe not, right? Because we're imperfect. But that being out there is not something valid in and for itself. And then he says something really startling here. Rather, it's the non-moral consciousness is the assumption, non-moral, that is held to be perfect. That's a thought that Hegel doesn't unpack at this point, that we'll have to consider more in the paragraphs yet to come. What about the other side? He says, equally it gives itself the character of a consciousness whose actuality, this is the real world consciousness, the person I am, who I'm conscious of being, not being in conformity with duty. I'm very aware in my own life that I'm often not in conformity with duty, and I'll bet that you are too, is superseded. Again, we see this Aufhebung, right? Here it's aufgehoben, right? And as superseded, or in the idea of absolute being, no longer contradicts morality. So we've got a pure duty that really exists only for some actual being that can recognize its own imperfection in relation to this ideal that exists only in pure thought. And on the other side, we have ourselves as the miserable people that we are, imperfect, conscious of our imperfection, but we're being brought to a higher level by being somehow related to this being that we're thinking, for which pure duty would not be a challenge the way it is for us. Hegel says that this brings the development of the moral consciousness to a certain fulfillment. Is it finished? No. So we have 5 more paragraphs yet to come in which we'll see how it continues to develop. But this is a very important turning point, isn't it? Because we're working here now with a more fully fleshed out notion of moral self-consciousness.